tucked deeply into a fold of the hammered metal of Grandma Lena's old steamer trunk, I found a very worn slip of paper. Most of what had been written on it is lost to time, faded away, but I think I made out the letters Dr. Robber. I'm not too sure now whether what we call Grandma Lena's box was always hers, or if it had originally belonged to her husband, Dr. Jonathan Robertshaw. Anyway, my genealogy research aside, we left Lena and Michael finding their way back onto the road in the rain, trying to get to a man with a deep laceration on his arm. So, here's part 3 of Grandma Lena's manuscript, dutifully transcribed. The Wanderers of Milladurra, 1880, by Lena Ellis. Part 3, 1862. Having taken an hour to get to the guy, the job ended up taking hours. Thankfully though, the emergency call taker had told him to put pressure on the wound, and that had stopped his brachial artery from bleeding him dry, so he wasn't dead when we got there. We trundled back into town by the light of early dawn, the rain having abated, heading in to restock the ambulance. Bleary-eyed from the long drive home in the early hours, I gazed out the windscreen. My gaze sharpened. Once again, the weirdness of the night seemed to fade into some other world as the light of day took over. I was doubting everything I'd seen in those minutes before 1 in the morning, starting to think we'd just gotten turned around in the rain and been confused. But there, amongst the mix of 60s shab and Outback Pioneer glamour, was that building I'd recognized. The post office, one of the oldest buildings in the town. 1862 was the date written above the door on the sandstone facade. I stared out at it as we drove past. I could have sworn just yesterday that the window frames and door of the old post office had been painted blue and black. Now they were painted white and red. Perhaps it was my stupid imagination, but I couldn't help recognizing it as 2 of the 3 colors our ambulance was painted. One thing I've got to say about a deluge in a dust bowl: damn, it smells good. It was its own kind of restorative to stand outside the station, stretch my legs and take a good sniff, even if I was speckled with another person's blood. We didn't try to go back to Jean and Mickey's before the start of our shift. Part of it was that we could shower, change, and have a brief nap at the station. The other part, for me at least, was not wanting to encounter Jean's wrath just yet. I assured her again we were fine by text, then headed into the bathroom. The day, after the excitement of the night, was boring. Near mid-morning, staring at my computer screen, I admitted to myself I had no interest in my computer game. Instead, I clicked out of it, pulled up a web browser, and punched Milladurra into the search. I wasn't the first to be interested in the tiny town's history. There was a Wikipedia article, short but sweet, an Exploring Australia page, and a brief mention of the town on a few other websites about the history of the country. Milladurra had started as a haphazard river port, being the site where goods to and from the surrounding areas could be exchanged with steamers up the river from Sydney. It then became a wayport for travelers, and by 1870 had become a budding town in its own right. In 1920, a train line was built to serve the town, providing a more reliable transport route, one that required neither the grueling horse and cart ride over land, nor was dependent on the sides of the river. It had ceased service in 1972. The highway that currently ran through the town, I found, was first constructed in 1923, after a new bridge over the river was built. The old road, there before Milladurra was a town, had been built by convicts transported to the then penal colony that was Australia. That old road wasn't in quite the same place the current highway was, and after nearly a century, there was next to nothing of it left. The air conditioner whirring next to me, I got obsessed with working out where that old road had been. I searched and searched through local history pages, old planning documents, scouring National Archives online for something that would show me the location. and I found it. Finally, after over an hour of searching. At the point the old road met Milladurra, it had been less than 100 meters from the site of the new highway. And the old road, little more than a dirt track, had led straight to the post office. I sat back in my chair. I still had no idea what the timber structure beside the post office had been. It wasn't there now. But I knew a few things. I knew the time when the area had just been a dirt road that led to a post office and little else had been between 1862, the date the post office was built, and 1870, when the area was created as a town. 8 years. Likely less than that, as Milladurra had been acquiring new settlers before it was declared a town in its own right. It was mind-boggling to me. Something remarkable to imagine. A time when, between distances so great, it took days to make journeys on foot or by horse. There had been a single waypoint in that wide outback landscape where the sky seemed enormous. A waypoint that had been nothing more than a dirt road with a post office, and what was either a warehouse for riverborne goods or an inn for travelers. That was it. No telephones. I thought I'd been out in the middle of nowhere, ages away from assistance if I needed it. Compared to the 1860s, I had no idea. What did you do if you sprained an ankle 5 days' walk away from the nearest homestead? Or maybe I did have an idea. Maybe I didn't need to imagine it. Maybe I'd seen it, for a brief moment, from the passenger seat of an ambulance suddenly far from where we had been. That brief moment where none of our communications technology, our GPS, worked. Icy prickles of the amazing, of the astounding, ran through my body and down my limbs. Is that what I'd done? Had I seen the past? And if we could do that, why the fuck weren't people flocking here to do it? I'd wanted to see history, to see how things had been. Many times before when driving through the narrow streets of Sydney. And after my imaginings had died, I'd always felt the incredible disappointment that seeing through time was impossible. Charged by the remarkable, I shoved my roller chair back and looked over to where Michael was having a snooze on the sofa. Oh, I wanted to tell him. I wanted to pick his brains and ask what the hell he thought of all I'd found online. I grimaced at his contented snores. And then the phone rang. "Fuck you," I told it, then answered. A job in town this time, and while the elderly person wasn't on their deathbed, they did have kidney stones, which sucked ass, and it toppled over in their kitchen. They also had cellulitis. After dosing them up with morphine, hefting them off the floor and out of the house, and getting them onto a hospital bed, I felt pretty covered in the weeping fluid that oozed out of those red and puffy legs. Jean and Mickey's boarding house looked like a refuge after that. I dropped Michael back at the station to man the fort and headed to my transient home for a change of clothes, and another shower. The kitchen wasn't empty when I entered it. Jean and Mickey, both silent, looked up at me as I stepped through the door. I got the sense they'd been talking about me just a second before I walked in. The profound silence filled the kitchen like an oppressive stench. "Hi," I said to them, then decided to follow that with, "I've got someone's body fluids right down my front. Was going to shower and change." Jean was eyeing me. She blinked, then simply nodded. Feeling like their gazes were boring holes in my back, I took myself to the bathroom. When I shut off the shower, the mute duo in the kitchen were no longer silent. Curious, I leaned my ear to the door, then, when that wasn't good enough, quietly cracked the door open to have a listen. "You've gotta let her know, Mom," Mickey was saying. "People don't follow rules when you don't tell them why." Now I was more curious. "Mom? As in mother?" I was half expecting a woman in her 80s to croak up, but it was only Jean who replied. Fuck off, Mickey. Think I haven't tried that? Ambos are all science and papers and rational shit. They write you off as a future patient the moment you tell them what it's all about. Yeah, but she's seen now. And hopefully she has the bloody sense not to do it again. I didn't really. I wanted to repeat the experience. But I was more preoccupied with that mom comment just now, especially after I heard Mickey use it again and get cut off by Jean. I slipped the door shut and pulled the face purely for my own benefit. Far be it for me to judge, but calling your partner mom didn't sit well with me. Doing it in the bedroom was at least a pure kink. Calling them that in the kitchen was just weird. I got dressed, stuffed the gross clothes in the hamper, and headed back to the kitchen. The two in it were once again silent as I approached. Mickey at the table, Jean stood by the stove like they had been on my first evening here. Alright. Jean cut me off. Lena, she said, sit. I looked towards the door. I've got to get back to the station, I protested. I'm still on shift. Jean glowered at me, her pale eyes stark and brooking no argument. Sit, she repeated. Michael can call you if he needs. You're 2 minutes away. That was true, though I felt it missed the point. Regardless, I sat. If I was to be told something, I did want to hear it. You were a complete dumbass last night, Jean began, quite confrontationally. Her back had stiffened. I'm gonna tell it to you straight, and if you don't believe me, then you're on your own. And then, standing stiff over me in another flowery top and grey leggings, she gave it to me. You got lucky. She snarked at me like I was a misbehaving youth. You got back. There's nothing to say you ever will again. You saw that wanderer. That's what being out of time does to you. You walk out that door at midnight. She shot the kitchen door a malevolent look. And you can be anywhere. It's not so fun when it's dinosaurs and you can't breathe because the air's not right. It's shithouse when you walk into a pack of convicts who haven't seen a woman in years. Or when you just get lost out there without water in the middle of fucking nowhere. It's not fucking fun and games, she just about yelled at me. It's not to be taken lightly. It's losing people. It's being lost. It's the end of the fucking world half the time. I thought you got it with the sounds of God knows what, but you didn't. And it turns people nuts, she finished vehemently, for the first time looking properly furious with me. I stared up at her. My mouth moved, then I said it. Are you seriously telling me I was in the past last night? Jean drew herself up taller. Those icy prickles of the amazing shot through me all over again, making my eyes want to water. Where were you? She asked. I took a deep breath. The 1860s, from what I can tell. Jean covered her eyes with a hand that dug into her temples. She turned around, caught up her cigarettes from the countertop and lit up. She was puffing smoke out the window for nearly a full minute before she turned back. You don't get back, she croaked at me, and it looked like her eyes were overbright. Red-rimmed, though I saw no sign of a tear. Hear me? You don't get back. You think you can, but then you're stuck, and you try again the next night. You just end up somewhere else. Beside me, Mickey was nodding solemnly. I looked back to Jean. She was rubbing her fingers over her mouth. She stopped, stuck the cigarette back between her lips, and took a deep drag. Exhaling out of her nose, she pointed the burning end of a cigarette at me. Don't go out, she implored me. You want to, but even looking is dangerous. Do it and you lose your shit. Don't drag Michael along with you either. He doesn't need fucking up. It was a dire warning, and it stuck with me for the next couple of days, making sure, despite the temptation, I didn't go out. I knew, over both nights, that Jean was sitting up in silent vigil in the kitchen, ready to stymie us if either Michael or I tried to leave the house before 1. Whether she told Michael as well, I wasn't sure, but he did want to talk about it, Far from the confused driving companion who questioned what in the world was going on with me that night, he shut down any attempt I made to broach the subject. He wouldn't talk about it. So I left it. And for the most part, things were normal. Until I was fetching a coffee on the main street, in the middle of yet another hot day, and heard it. Not the demon beast, though that would have made my blood run cold, and my curiosity peak. What I heard could only be described as the sounds of many men picking at a dirt road, of grumbled and chattered conversation, bawdy jokes barely heard that produced laughter, a distracting soundscape that made my mind warp. Sure, I was hearing something other, hearing something I wasn't seeing. It made me spin around to look up at the tall old post office, looming above me from across the street. 1862. It sent shivers down my spine. Sent me to guzzling my coffee, hoping caffeine wasn't out. If it was, I can't tell you for sure, but the sounds died away like they'd never even been there. That was the only occasion. For 2 weeks. We'd stopped in town to find lunch after dropping someone off at the hospital. Michael had headed somewhere for fried chicken. I'd chosen the cheaper option of a grocery store sandwich. I dallied by the shop's doors, not ready to brave the heat outside just yet. Taking 2 bites of my sandwich, I got up enough courage to walk out. I didn't go much further, staying under the overhanging shade outside the door. I could see the ambulance from here, so I could hurry back if we got a job. There weren't many people out in the middle of a hot day. I didn't spot her at first, but when I did, I eyed her from where I stood. Rather than shorts and a t-shirt, the woman was wearing full-length skirts and a puffy white blouse. She even had on an apron, and I was pretty sure she was wearing a corset. It was weird enough to see anyone wearing that. I'd like to say I watched her because I was a little worried she'd get heat exhaustion, but I wasn't. I was eyeing her because I was seriously starting to wonder whether I was watching someone from the 1800s. That, and she was darting looks down the road. In between looks, she backed away, shrinking behind the side of the grocery store, as though she was scared of seeing something, but watching for it anyway. She looked real. Not like some ghost or echo. Though she didn't seem to notice me. I saw her duck back behind the shop and then got distracted by the clopping of hooves. I looked the other way down the road, expecting someone on horseback. I watched a beaten-up ute drive past, but there was nothing else coming up the road. The hairs prickled at the back of my neck again. Sure, I'd heard something other, again. The sound of horse hooves had disappeared, the street empty. I looked back to where I'd seen the woman. She wasn't there. Walking over to where she had been, I peered down the side of the shop. There wasn't only no woman there, in full skirts or otherwise. There was no way you could stand there. Up against the side of the grocer's were shrubs, thick and tall, that continued right along the side of the shop to the front of a house. I'd stepped out into the sun now, and the squinting it made me do had me reflecting on how the woman hadn't been squinting at all. I caught sight of something up the road, like a ghostly whisk of skirts around a low fence at the end of the block. Forgetting my sandwich, I hurried after it. I was looking along the intersecting road well before I reached the corner, before a woman pulling stiff-dried washing off a line as her children ran around the front garden. There wasn't anyone there. I looked around properly, squinting in the bright sun, yet the only thing my eyes landed on was a pile of red rocks organized as a stack in the corner of the family's front garden. Uluru. I looked up. The woman taking down her washing unpegged the last item. She tossed the towel into the basket and gestured to the stack of rocks. She wasn't making eye contact with me, but many indigenous people won't as a sign of respect. I still figured she was talking to me. People take the rocks from Uluru, she said. Come on holiday and take 'em away. Then they read about some curse and think it's bad luck they stole the rocks. So they send him back. But people who steal rocks from Uluru aren't people who know much. They send them anywhere in the post. So long as it's Australia, they think they've fixed some curse. I nodded slowly. My mind was still half on the woman in the full skirts. So they get sent here? I asked. Send them anywhere, the woman repeated, tossing the peg she had in her hand into a bucket. The post office gets the rocks. They send it to my family because we are Aboriginal. My dad was an elder, but we are not Anangu. We are not custodians of Uluru. People don't know the different mobs. They just think Aboriginal is Aboriginal. So any Aboriginal would like rocks from Uluru. The post office gave us those rocks. I was trying to work out what to say to that when I got a call from dispatch, squawking into my ear over the radio. I acknowledged the job they'd given Michael and me, then looked back to the woman. Is it right to return them to Uluru? I asked. The woman shook her head back and forth and again and again. Where on Uluru were they stolen from? She said. How do you know? People send them back without telling what part they picked them up from. You can send them to Uluru, but they won't go back to where they came from. Over the rest of the day, I thought of that again and again. It overtook my fixation on the woman with the full skirts, corset, and long sleeves. And when I dreamed that night, it was of Victorian dresses and red rocks. Strange perceptions became more frequent after that. It might be the sound of hooves or construction, unrelated to anything I could see around me, or an odd glimpse in the corner of my eye. Treating an injured roofer not far from the ambulance station one morning, I was sure I could hear the whistle of a steam train. Barely a minute later, I jumped so far out of my skin at the sense that a train was racing up right behind me, I lost the pressure I was keeping on the man's wound for a second. I went over later that day, once back at the station after dropping the roofer off at the hospital, to check the area around where I'd heard the train. The street had houses on both sides, but the road ended just beyond the ambulance station. I stepped off the road into outback bush, and only had to look around for a few seconds to find a bit of rusted iron train track lying on its side in the red dirt. I found a few more like it nearby, and even some rail sleepers still sunken into the ground, patchy gravel around them. I tried to talk about it with Michael, but once again he just accepted the information that there had been a railroad right across the street from the station, and didn't want to talk about me hearing the train earlier that day. He said he hadn't heard anything, and though he wasn't curt or unfriendly about it, he just went back to watching TV. The roster changed, meaning I had to work more days in a row without a day off. Michael got lucky, getting a few extra days off before his next shift. Unlike me, he used his days off to head back to Sydney and his girlfriend. I came home from shift one day to a house that was back to holding only me, Jean, and Mickey. And I continued to notice odd little things. Seeing things that weren't there, though, and got spookier after dark. I smiled at the sight of a young girl in the window as we pulled up to a house for an elderly man who'd fallen and injured his leg. For a second, as Rob jumped out to grab the kits, I switched on the red and blue ambulance lights, making the dark street look lit up like we'd bought a Christmas tree to it. It was a little thing we could do to give kids a thrill when they saw us, but the girl through the window didn't react, and, feeling stupid, I switched the lights off. "What was that for?" Rob asked as I joined him with the ECG monitor. I just shrugged, feeling silly about taking the time to switch on the lights when the girl had obviously not appreciated it, and her grandfather was waiting for us in pain. The little girl wasn't in the window anymore anyway. "Bump the switch," I answered, swinging the strap of the ECG monitor over my shoulder. The grandfather was on his own in the living room, lying back down on the floor with what looked like a fractured fibula. "I've got to go to the hospital?" he asked, his voice creaky, once we'd gotten him comfortable and propped up against the sofa. Rob looked up from preparing the splint. "Try that foot," he said, nodding to the man's sore leg. "Give it a wiggle." The elderly man frowned, confused but did as instructed. He winced despite the morphine. "You've got to go to the hospital," Rob said to the cardboard splinters he shaped it. He hadn't even needed to see the man's wince. "You can't walk. How are you going to go about living here on your own?" It risked a fat embolism to move that ankle more than needed, but I kept my mouth shut. Rob wouldn't appreciate me calling him out on instructing the man to wiggle his foot. And in some fairness to Rob, I didn't actually think the elderly man would agree to go to the hospital unless we gave him a good reason why he should. And Rob's was a sufficient way to demonstrate that. That and a foot wiggle while I held his ankle in place wasn't a big movement. "Do you have anyone you can call to look after the kid?" I asked the man. The man blinked, old bloodshot eyes. He looked over at me. "What kid?" he said. "The little girl," I said. "I saw her in the window." The man shook his head slowly, frowning at me. "I don't have a little girl," he said. "I'm an old man. My kids are grown and moved away. And good on them." I stayed silent, but the fact that I'd seen a non-existent little girl there in the front window of the house sent chills down my spine.